Mom gave me cash, suggesting I should forgive my brother for getting my future wife pregnant 2 months before we were supposed to get hitched. I didn't do it, though. I took the money and decided that what goes around comes around. 3 years back, I was engaged to a woman I'll call Leela. Back then, I really thought she was the one I would spend my life with. Leela and I had been together for nearly 5 years, and our relationship seemed really strong. We were both lawyers, working those super busy, high-pressure jobs, yet we always carved out time for each other. That year I asked Leela to marry me was supposed to be the best year ever, but things went sideways. Leela lost her job because she broke some company rules. I won't explain what happened, it's private, but the company let her go in a pretty embarrassing way. If you've ever known someone who is a total perfectionist and workaholic, you know how getting fired can completely mess them up. Work wasn't just a job for Leela. It was who she was, her sense of self-worth, and her reason for doing things. The sudden loss of it just crushed her. She immediately started looking for another job, submitting applications to tons of different places. Sadly, because of her specific skills, there weren't a lot of openings, particularly given how she had left her last job. Time went by and she still hadn't found anything. Through it all, I tried to be there for her. I told her not to fret about money. We were engaged, and I felt like it was my job to look after her while she was going through a hard time. I knew she had a habit of overanalyzing things and getting worked up, so I suggested she unwind and not let it get the best of her. It made me happy that she actually listened, or at least she gave it a shot. Since she now had some extra time, she decided to go after a goal she'd had for a while, learning about landscaping. She signed up for a local landscaping course and dedicated her free time to this new interest. By chance, my brother Mason was also taking the class. Let me tell you a little bit about him. He's completely different from me. While my focus growing up was always academics and career, Mason was easygoing and often got into trouble. He had a reputation as a ladies' man, and it stayed with him through college and later. He was never with the same girl for very long and rarely took anything seriously. Leela had met Mason early on in our time together and was fully aware of who he was. So when she started the landscaping class with Mason, I figured their paths crossing was just a random event. Looking back, that's when things started to shift. After a few weeks, they seemed to become surprisingly close. At first, I didn't pay much attention to it. Mason would occasionally offer her rides to and from class, which seemed thoughtful, though it seemed odd. Leela would come home really enthusiastic, telling me stories about things she and Mason had done in class or showing me pictures of their projects. However, soon, their communication went beyond the class. Weekends used to be our time. Leela and I would go to art museums or try those new restaurants, things we always loved to do together. However, now she was doing those things with Mason. As time passed, I noticed a real change in Leela. She was spending so much more time with Mason than I was okay with, even breaking our date nights to be with him. I'm not one to keep quiet and let things get worse, so one night I just came out and asked her straight up. I directly asked her if something was going on between her and Mason. Leela appeared shocked and even seemed upset at my question. She completely denied any kind of wrongdoing and claimed her time with Mason was completely friendly. She described it as fun and easygoing, like spending time with a younger sibling. She seemed honestly hurt that I would even think such a thing. For a second, I felt terrible for questioning her. However, deep down, her words didn't quite ease my worries. The situation really blew up only 8 weeks before our wedding. At that point, I was working like crazy trying to manage all our money. Because Leela was unemployed, I had taken on all the financial burden for our home and the wedding. Despite her using a portion of her savings for herself, I was handling most of the costs. With the long hours I was working and the stress of planning the wedding, I wasn't as attentive as I should have been. Looking back now, maybe that provided the opportunity for Leela and Mason to become as close as they did. I got back from a work trip way ahead of schedule, hoping to catch Leela off guard and hang out with her. When I drove up to the house, the first thing I saw was my brother Mason's car sitting in the drive. I wouldn't typically have given it a second thought. Mason had a tendency to just pop over unannounced, but this felt off. It was after 9 at night, and spotting his car that late set off an alarm bell in my head. I moved deliberately, pausing outside the bedroom door. And there they were, Leela and Mason, wrapped up in a way that was intensely personal. They were so lost in the moment that they didn't see me standing there. I'm usually pretty level-headed, but this was the ultimate stab in the back. Without a sound, I just went into the room. I went up to the bed and took hold of the back of Mason's neck, yanking him away from Leela. The look of surprise on his face was almost a small victory. He turned to look at me and his face changed immediately from being clueless to sheer fear. I didn't even look at Leela. Mason started to stumble over apologies, but his words didn't register. I landed a punch right on his nose, and the sound of bone breaking gave me a twisted sense of satisfaction as blood started to pour from his face. He let out a cry of pain, but I wasn't finished. I hit him again. Again I hit him. Then again, each blow hitting harder than the one before. His nose was bleeding, staining his shirt, but I was past caring. Mason took a step back, making an effort to shield himself, but I just kept on hitting. As he lay there, covered in blood and pleading for me to cease, I shifted my focus to Leela. She was on the bed, shaking and crying uncontrollably. Looking directly at her, I informed her she had a mere 10 minutes to be gone from my home. I made it clear that if she failed to comply, I wouldn't think twice about leaving her in the same condition as my brother. She began to beg, repeatedly apologizing and claiming she could provide explanations, imploring me not to kick her out and to give her a chance to make amends. However, I had zero interest in listening to her justifications or contrition. I checked my watch and said in a cold tone, "You now have 9 minutes." The way I spoke and the expression in my eyes must have conveyed I was absolutely serious, because she quickly got off the bed, her hands trembling as she began to get dressed. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she retrieved a suitcase from the closet and began to hastily pack her belongings. Once she was finished and lugging the half-filled suitcase down the stairs, she turned toward me one final time. Her voice was cracking as she begged me to listen, stating that she loved me and merited an opportunity to explain herself. Without uttering a word, I removed her engagement ring and pushed her toward the doorway. She struggled, pleading with me to change my mind, but I was through with it all. I opened the door and shoved her out into the darkness. She remained on the porch, still sobbing and begging for forgiveness, yet I refused to glance back as I slammed the door shut. Mason, still bearing the marks of our brawl, was slumped on the floor. Even though I was absolutely livid, I didn't want to escalate things, so I reached out to my folks and recounted the whole situation. My father was beyond angry with Mason, and my mother seemed completely stunned, but they both declared they'd come over right away. After they got there, my mom, being a registered nurse, started attending to Mason's injuries. Fortunately, they weren't too serious. At the same time, my dad ushered me into the backyard to help me cool down because my hands were still shaking from my fury. Eventually, Mason came outside with my mom and joined us in the yard. His face was marked with bruises, his nose was covered in a bandage, and his shirt still had blood on it. He said he was sorry for hurting me, saying he never intended for everything to fall apart like this. However, that's when he dropped a major shocker. He confessed he was in love with Leela. Enraged, I finally looked at him. He continued explaining that he believed Leela felt the same way about him. He tried to reassure me it was the first time they'd been intimate, like that somehow made it okay. Then he took out his phone and showed me their messages, chats filled with flirting, secret talks, and Leela admitting how miserable she was in our relationship. Based on Mason's version, she had asked him to come over that night, under the impression I would still be away on my work trip. As I looked through those messages, my anger began to surge again. Mason kept talking, apologizing for betraying me, and also asserting that he'd never had these kinds of feelings for anyone else before. He claimed he couldn't control himself and pleaded with me to forgive him. My dad, who'd been quietly observing everything, finally spoke up. He said Mason was fortunate if he escaped the same fate I'd inflicted on his place. My mom, though, responded in a completely different manner. Mason had always been her favorite son, and I could tell she was having a tough time with all of this. She started to explain that no matter what choices I made concerning Leela, I should forgive my brother. She insisted he seemed truly sorry and that brothers shouldn't let a woman create a rift between them. She even offered me some funds to pay for the wedding, but when I said I'd accept her check but not her guidance, she took back the offer. I interrupted her and told both my parents I didn't need any sermons or pointers at that time. All I wanted in that moment was for them to take Mason and just go. I couldn't stand to look at him. My dad nodded, understanding that I needed some breathing room, and helped Mason get into the car. My mom paused, clearly wanting to stay and smooth things over, but finally went after them. During the following weeks, I was still reeling from the whole situation. Leela had been constantly sending me texts, pleading for forgiveness and attempting to explain herself. Yet her explanations always amounted to the same old, worn-out reasons, the ones that just rehashed everything Mason had said. She insisted that neither of them had ever aimed to cause me any pain. I avoided her texts for a full week, and then, completely unexpectedly, Mason called me. He revealed to me that he and Leela had just learned she was carrying his child. He shared that since she was going to have his baby, he wanted to get married and was requesting my approval, which I flat out denied. My mother's response just made matters more complicated. She'd already been attempting to bridge the gap between Mason and me, but now it felt like she saw Leela's pregnancy as some kind of miracle. She said it was God's will that Leela got pregnant like this, and maybe Mason and Leela were always destined to be together. It felt like she was trying to excuse the inexcusable, rationalizing their actions because it aligned with her newfound dream of becoming a grandmother. I stated directly to my mom that I knew exactly what she was doing, and if she chose to support Mason and Leela, our relationship would be finished. I was not kidding around. My brother's disloyalty was already tough to deal with, but my own mother backing him up was more than I could handle. My dad tried to stay out of it, maybe thinking it would lessen the stress. However, my mom offered Leela financial assistance, promising her that she and the baby would be provided for, but naturally there was a catch. My mom insisted that Mason and Leela had to get married. That was Mason's goal, too. Mom was unwavering in her focus on this result. not even entertaining the idea of her grandchild being born outside of marriage. Once I heard that Mason and Leela were actually going to tie the knot, and they'd begun dispatching wedding invitations to our family members, I was filled with rage and profound shame. I didn't say anything, but I focused on my job and completely severed all contact with both my mother and Mason. Nevertheless, my mom wasn't someone who gives up quickly. For several weeks after everything blew up, she constantly called me, left tons of voice messages, and even unexpectedly appeared at my doorstep, attempting to manipulate me into making up with her. It was unbearable. That was the point I understood. The sole way to get away from her was to move far, far away. It's been 3 years since they ruined everything for me. I relocated to a different city and distanced myself from almost everyone in my family except my father. He supported my choice to leave and grasped why I needed the separation, even though he was sad I no longer visited. Throughout these 3 years, I've carefully reconstructed my life. I didn't give my new phone number to anybody besides my dad. I made new acquaintances, regained a feeling of stability, and really put effort into forgetting the past. Therefore, picture my astonishment when just yesterday I discovered Leela at my door, pushing the doorbell. When I opened the door, I almost didn't know her. She looked completely different from the woman I once cared about. She looked ill or like she had suffered greatly over time. There she was, holding the hand of a small child who couldn't have been more than 2 or 3 years old. The kid had Mason's distinct face, so there was no doubt about who the dad was. I was curious as to why she was standing there. I wondered, how did she even manage to track me down? What did she need from me? Eventually, I ended the quiet. "Leela, what brings you here?" I questioned. She was sobbing, pleading with me to open the door, claiming she had something vital to talk about. Initially, I wanted to just tell them to leave, but then I saw the little girl standing next to her, her big, guileless eyes fixated on me. I couldn't be impolite with the kid present, so I moved out of the way and signaled for them to come inside. I led them to the sofa and offered them some water to drink. After they were comfortable, I sat across from them and asked, "What are you doing here?" I already knew she wouldn't have been able to locate me on her own. No one knew my address except my father, and I trusted him to keep it private unless it was truly important. Therefore, I figured, what could be so pressing that he revealed where I lived? Instead of responding right away, Leela reached into her bag and took out an envelope. She passed it to me without speaking. I opened it and instantly recognized my mother's penmanship. The letter was straightforward. It stated that it was my job to fix the problem Mason created. It explained how Leela and Jesse were having a hard time, how Mason had deserted them, and how, as Mason's brother and Jesse's uncle, I was duty-bound to support them. She also reminded me that Leela was the woman who nearly became my wife and that Jessie was my niece. I looked at Leela, both bewildered and annoyed. "What is this supposed to mean?" I questioned. Leela just crumbled, spilling all of her secrets to me. She said Mason had cheated on her the whole time they were married, even after Leela had Jessie, their little girl. Throughout their entire relationship, my brother just kept on having his flings. Leela, from her perspective, had put in a lot of effort to salvage things, always holding on to the belief that things would eventually get better, especially for Jesse's well-being. However, 3 months prior, Mason suddenly grabbed all of his belongings and departed. He left with no explanation, no letter, not even a heads-up. He just vanished. Leela had been struggling on her own ever since that moment. She was unemployed, with no money saved up and no place to live. They had been renting a house together, but without him, she couldn't cover the costs. My mom, feeling some kind of responsibility for Jessie, had been giving Leela cash to help them get by. Now, since Mason seemed to be permanently out of the picture, my mom had declared she didn't want to shoulder the burden of supporting Leela and Jessie anymore. Leela went on, claiming my mom thought I should take care of her and Jessie since they had nowhere else to go. I felt utterly disgusted by her request, and how insane it was that she and my mom both expected me to step in. My mom had not only taken Mason's side when the affair first surfaced, but now she was trying to make me deal with the fallout of his choices. Her obvious preference for Mason was rearing its ugly head once more. I told Leela flat out, right there in front of her daughter, that she shouldn't anticipate any help from me whatsoever. Jessie wasn't my kid after all. Plus, Leela wasn't my fiancée any longer. This whole situation wasn't even my problem to solve. Even though I was sad Mason deserted her, it wasn't a shock. He's never been dependable or followed through on anything. I wasn't going to let myself be pressured into getting involved, so I told Leela she had to go. She immediately started sobbing, claiming she had no place to go and that she was broke, explaining that what little money she had left went for gas to get to my house. Finally, I gave her enough cash to fill her car with gas before asking her to leave. Now for an update. There are a few things I want to touch on. My mother's actions during this situation are just as confusing to me as they probably are to everyone else. I feel like her attempts to guilt-trip me into helping Leela and her kid, after everything, feels incredibly self-serving. I get that she could feel some sense of responsibility since it's her grandchild, but it's absurd for her to think I should fix the problems created by her favorite child. Considering everything that happened, I was the one who was hurt. If my mom wants to play favorites, that's her right, but she should take responsibility for him too. I'm also in agreement with some of the comments about my dad. He also let me down, but in a different way. Instead of giving me the help I really needed after everything that went down, he chose to remain on the fence. Sure, he told my brother off at one point, but he never fully stood by me. By not confronting my mom's manipulative actions, he also played a part in hurting me. I'm going to have a talk with him soon about all of this. It's a fact that Mason and Leela are no longer together, but that doesn't mean I have to step in and look after her. Leela chose her own path in life, and even though I can offer some compassion given the situation, I don't have any obligation to help her. The reality is that she arrived at my place with nothing but a hard luck story and a little kid, which just proves how desperate she is. I didn't slam the door in her face because I was being mean. What I did do was make it plain that fixing what Mason messed up isn't my problem. It's not my duty to take care of her just because she's going through a hard time at the moment, and to be clear, that child is definitely not mine. Leela and I had split up a few weeks before she found out she was expecting, and by the time we called it quits we hadn't been close in some time. There's no way I'm the father, it's completely obvious. I wouldn't even consider needing a test or any of that kind of thing. Also, the little girl Jessie has all of Mason's characteristics, his face, his eyes, even his smile. It's like looking at a younger version of Mason. I don't have any question that Mason is her dad. A DNA test wouldn't be needed because it's obvious who her father is. The little girl is Mason's daughter, and I'm done letting myself get tangled up in any more confusion. No, I won't be taking her in. I can hardly believe some people are even bringing that up. No matter what Leela's money situation or emotional state is, she's the one who gave birth, and so she's responsible for her. Frankly, I don't get why she didn't work after she got married or why she didn't put any money aside. As the father, Mason's the one, even though they're no longer together, who needs to shoulder the burden along with Leela when it comes to their child. He really has no other option. Mason's legally bound to make those child support payments. In my second update, I decided to talk with my parents about all of this. Although I knew for sure my dad had given Leela my address, I wanted to get confirmation from him directly. I got on the phone with him and asked right out why he agreed to tell her where I lived, especially after I had repeatedly asked him not to. I also asked him what exactly he thought I should do for Leela and her child after all this time. My dad didn't say anything at first. He seemed really uneasy. Then he gave a heavy sigh and said he was sorry. "I'm sorry, son, truly," he told me. We tried everything we could to help Leela, but with Mason gone for so long, there wasn't much more we could do. Your mom pleaded with me to give her your address. She thought that if you saw her after all this time, you might want to assist her in some way since she has no other place to go. My anger started to boil. I asked him, why on earth would you even consider I'd want to help someone like her? She was unfaithful with Mason and caused me pain, and now you want me to offer her assistance. He acknowledged that he understood why I was upset and said that neither he nor my mom had wanted it to go down like this. But to them, Leela and her daughter were now part of the family, and they thought I was the only one who could. He apologized again, but I wasn't going to let it go. I made it very clear that we were finished. I'd hoped he wouldn't be like my mother, but he proved to be just like her, someone who betrays your trust. Did they seriously believe I'd wipe the slate clean, embrace Leela and my brother's kid, and start taking care of them? It was painful to grasp that my parents truly weren't concerned about my well-being. I told my father in a firm voice to delete my number from his phone and act like I never existed. Because he already knew where I lived, I told him that if either he or my mother ever showed up at my place, I'd call the authorities. He tried to say he was sorry again, pleading for me to hear him out, but I had no desire to listen. Don't call me again, I stated emphatically. Just stop. You made your decisions, and now I'm making mine. If you're holding out for a final word, that's too bad for you. I ended the call and immediately blocked his phone number. What my dad did is inexcusable. There's no recovering from this. It's been almost a month since I last gave an update. With the assistance of a friend, I managed to locate Mason. As it turned out, Leela was telling the truth. Mason has been residing with his new girlfriend in a town not too far away, acting like he has no obligations, like he doesn't have any family. Frankly, I'm not shocked. That's been his consistent pattern for as long as I can recall. I still can't fathom this is the same individual who, 3 years ago, looked me in the eyes and claimed he was in love with Leela. The same man who completely disrupted my life. And so, after all of it, once he grew tired of Leela and their little girl, he moved on to another woman. Leela was aware of this fact about him. She knew what kind of guy my brother truly was, yet still opted to hurt me by being unfaithful with him. Therefore, I don't feel sympathy for her, not at all. It's comparable to being warned something is hot and touching it regardless. You're inevitably going to get hurt. After discovering Mason's location, I forwarded the address to Leela. I wanted to avoid being pulled further into her mess, but I also didn't want to forsake a child who didn't ask to come into this world with such unreliable parents. I offered her one last bit of guidance. You should get a lawyer immediately and file for divorce and demand child support. Do it now before Mason vanishes again. Leela expressed her gratitude, and I could practically hear the release in her tone. She said she was sorry again, similar to how she had many times before, but I simply didn't want to hear it any longer. I was finished. I sent her a text message to make my position perfectly clear. Do not contact me from this moment on. Don't ever show up at my place. This is the last thing I will ever do to help you. Whatever our relationship was, if it ever signified anything, concluded a long time ago. Just leave me alone once and for all. I made my desire for her absence from my life abundantly clear. This phase of things is definitively finished. I need to give you some background about my brother in order to explain what's going on. He never got his degree and has been relying on short-term jobs ever since. At one point, he was taking a landscaping course because he hoped to be able to land a job in that area. Even though he works in roles that are quite versatile, he manages to stay free from being rooted to a single location. Based on what I've shared before, you probably can predict where this is going. Yep, my brother has relocated, or to be more accurate, he's bolted. It seems he's bolted. It sounds like he learned Leela intended to sue him for child support, and his immediate response was to take off. He vacated his girlfriend's place, and when Leela showed up there to speak with him, she was informed he had already departed. His girlfriend insisted she had no clue where he'd gone, but it's impossible to determine whether that was the truth or just a fabrication. I got all this information because Leela sent me an email. She was looking for my assistance to help locate him once again. I pointed out to her that she'd once again violated my boundaries by ignoring my request not to contact me. So no, I told her, I was not going to assist her. My parents also double-crossed me again. Following my dad's apology, they both showed up at my place without an invitation. I won't bother you with the specific details of their request. You probably know what they were after. They tried to persuade me to provide for Leela and my niece. I told them directly that I would not spend another cent on that woman, especially after I threw away so much money on a wedding that never came to be, a financial setback they were perfectly okay with at the time. And here's the thing. My mother suggested she'd be open to giving back some of the money if I accepted responsibility for Leela and my niece. I explained to her that if she was prepared to give me a check at that very moment, I might contemplate whether it was even reasonable to contemplate the possibility of taking Leela back, meaning it was pretty much out of the question. She paused for a moment but ultimately wrote me a check for $1,000. While that barely put a dent in the wedding expenses, well, it was still better than nothing, I supposed. I told them to get out of my sight, reiterating that the check didn't prevent me from calling the authorities if they came back. They departed in a hurry. I pondered for a good 5 seconds about whether using my brainpower on Leela was a good idea, and the conclusion was a definite negative. I probably used more time to cash the check than I took to come to that determination. The bright side, the check went through without issue. I phoned my mother to fill her in, and she wasn't pleased. She insisted that since I had accepted her money, I should at least do what I suggested I would, but there was no commitment made. Even if there had been a signed agreement, the check was only payment for me to contemplate it. I've wasted too much time on this already. Had the check been for a bigger amount, I might have considered it for a couple more seconds, but the outcome would have remained the same, with no action being taken. My mother made a mistake attempting to manipulate someone with a background in law who also felt profoundly hurt. Update 5. Now my mom wants her money back. I told her she could feel free to take me to court if she believed she had legal standing. There's no written deal, no messages on my phone, absolutely nothing in writing. Even if she actually made a recording of our phone call detailing my choices, there's nothing about taking Leela in return for cash. Frankly, it'd be a pretty funny situation to see play out in court. Furthermore, I could always file a lawsuit in response. On top of that, my brother is back in the picture, and Leela has finally succeeded in officially serving him those legal documents. You won't believe it, but who does Mason want to represent him? Yep, it's me. I wish him the best of luck trying to find someone who will work for nothing, because I'm definitely not doing it. He's broke, and I'm simply not willing to help him out. And as for Leela, I hope she has success getting something significant out of Mason. If she was looking for financial stability, she should not have picked a guy like him.